Welcome back to the Modern Mystics podcast. I'm excited to talk to you this week about the upcoming Winter Solstice, and it's a perfect follow-up to our discussion last week of prioritizing self-care, especially around the holiday season. So here we go. Welcome to the Modern Mystics podcast. I'm your host, Alanna, the yoga doctor. I'm here to help you realize your potential as a spiritual leader and elevate your work in the realm of yoga, mysticism, and spirituality. This podcast covers all of our favorite topics: yoga, alchemy, astrology, divination, spirituality, psychology, ritual, and mystical practices, both ancient and modern. Get ready to uplevel your status as a modern mystic. All right, well, I hope that everyone is having a decently smooth and relaxed December. No matter what holiday you celebrate or don't, December is still a big month, no matter where in the world you are. For those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, we are rolling right into the Winter Solstice, which is our primary topic of conversation today. But if you are in the Southern Hemisphere, you are moving toward the Summer Solstice, which will have pretty much the opposite connotation than what I'm going to discuss during this podcast, but it is still super relevant and something that you may want to demarcate, especially as December is also the end of the year. I don't know about you, but 2019 has been a big challenge for me, full of ups and downs and some things I didn't plan on. And I'm sure that everyone has the same kinds of things every year, and every year can be a challenge, but in my world, 2019 was, let's just say, extra special. So if you have a similar outlook on 2019, then I hope that you are taking some extra special care of yourself this December. If you want to go further in your self-care, especially in the terms of a modern mystic, by looking at some of the yogic practices that help sustain you and help you turn inward at this time of year, then I hope that you'll consider joining my highereducation.yoga membership. And of course, for all my podcast listeners, you can get a $1 trial at highereducation.yoga/trial. And in December, we are focusing on our self-care, which is what I talked about last podcast. So if you missed that one, make sure you go back and check it out, because there's some great tips and tools there for you to stay sane all year, not just in December. So December marks the Winter Solstice, again, for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere. And this has always been my most favorite astronomical and astrological holiday. So it is both because we are on planet Earth and the Earth goes around the sun, and the Earth is tilted slightly on its axis, and that's what actually gives us the seasons. For about half the year, the Earth is pointed in one direction toward the sun, which will give that top half of the Earth summer, and the bottom half winter, the bottom that is pointed away. And then as it goes around the other 6 months, the top half is pointed away, which gives us winter, and the bottom half is pointed more closely to the sun, which gives them summer. So we sort of wobble around the sun, giving us the seasons. And this tilt is observed in the sky by the path of the sun, right? Because we can't observe from the sun's perspective because we're on Earth. So here on Earth, as we look in the sky, we see the sun doing a couple of things. It gets higher in the sky as the summer comes toward us because the days are getting longer, and it gets lower in the sky as winter is upon us because the days are getting shorter. And the days do progressively get shorter as we move through fall towards the winter solstice, which is usually on about December 21st. And the solstice, the Latin of the word solstice actually means longest night. So we are looking for the longest day. It has to do with the sun and the length of the day. So the winter solstice, we have the very short day, so as little sun as we'll ever see in the year, and the longest night, the longest dark night that we'll ever see in the year. And this is a really important event, okay? So this is an astronomical event. This is actually happening in the sky, but this is also an astrological event because many stories have been made about this solstice event. It has marked the lives, the calendars, the holidays, the years, the harvests, the behavior of humankind throughout history. So if you think about ancient peoples who didn't necessarily have the technology to understand what was happening with the Earth being slightly tilted on its axis and not really knowing that even the Earth was not even close to being, not even the center of our galaxy, but not even the center of the universe. So we're just a little rock floating out in space, basically a third of the way out of the Milky Way, which is the galaxy that we're in. And the Milky Way itself is basically one sort of insignificant galaxy amongst billions and billions out there. So ancient peoples had no idea about that particularly, but they did know what the weather felt like, right? They could feel the coldness coming. And they would have been able to track the length of the days, and they would have noticed the days getting shorter. Now, without specific calculations, it can be difficult to tell from one day to the next exactly how many minutes shorter each day is, but over the course of a week, you can absolutely tell that the sun is not appearing during the day as much as you'd like it to. I think that those of us in the Northern Hemisphere right now are certainly experiencing this. I was out this afternoon, headed to my local YMCA for my afternoon swim, which is something that I enjoy. And when I came out from the swim, it was jarringly dark. And, swimming always puts me in a mood of beach vacations and summers and sun. So it was very strange to come out and have it be completely black. And it wasn't even that late. It was just after 4 p.m. So we do notice, even in our day-to-day lives, that the days get shorter. This is a big deal. For ancient peoples, it was a big deal. For us today, it's still a big deal. And the stories that are created around it are the astrological context. Astrology is merely a collection of stories of things that have been observable in the sky that eventually end up having truth to them. So we, as people who notice that the night is getting longer, we're paying more attention to the darkness. And this darkness is important, okay? It's not just literal. Yes, there is literally more darkness happening right now, but it is also metaphorical, it's spiritual, it's psychological, and it's an important thing to note. And I want to talk about this specifically because so many of us in the spiritual community, in the spiritual realm, in yoga, focus only on the light. We want to focus on all of the sparkles, rainbows, and butterflies and not touch the dark. Well, that's not a good idea. There's a term for that. It's called spiritual bypassing. And this is an actual psychological term. I did not make that up. And spiritual bypassing occurs when we focus so much on the light that we either pretend the dark doesn't exist, we overlook it, we sweep it under the rug, we try to ignore it, we pretend like we don't have any, and we try to use our spiritual practices only to affirm the light, never to examine the dark. And this has huge ramifications and is actually quite psychologically, potentially dangerous for us. Because the reality is that there is so much to be gained, learned, understood, mined from the dark. And I know it's scary, right? Monsters live in the dark. That's why we're scared of the dark as kids. Maybe we're still scared of the dark as adults. But oftentimes those monsters that seem to lurk or loom large in our closets or under our bed are actually the source of our greatest wisdom, the source of our greatest strength, the source of our greatest transformation. And as yogis, what are we looking for if not transformation? So before I continue with my talk about specifically the solstice, I want to take you back for a moment. It was about 20 years ago that I started my own yoga practice, and I didn't grow up with any kind of spiritual or religious tradition. It was pretty bleak in terms of spirituality or religion for me, mostly as a kid. Easter was about trees Easter was about bunnies and Christmas was about trees, and that's about it. And so you can imagine that as soon as I started to explore spirituality, especially in terms of yoga, I was pretty excited and immersed myself very quickly in the practice and was really thrilled to have that support. And there was a local yoga studio very close to my home where I lived. Back then I was living in Colorado. And on the local yoga studio schedule, on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. was a class called satsang. And I'd never heard of satsang. And being new to yoga, I thought it was just another form of yoga practice, like vinyasa. So I showed up on the Sunday morning ready for yoga, ready for downward dog and upward dog, and had my yoga pants on and my mat ready and everything. And I walked in and everybody's dressed in normal clothes and they're all just sitting in a circle. Because the term satsang, it literally means attachment to the truth. And the idea is that you are attaching yourself to a fellow group of people who are also interested in uplifting themselves spiritually, who are also attached to the truth. So it's your spiritual group, so to speak. And the lead teacher would do this amazing practice every Sunday morning of mantra, meditation, and a Dharma talk. So he would tell us about something in yoga. We would chant a little bit. We would meditate. It was really wonderful. And it essentially became my yoga church every Sunday, far before I knew what anything really meant. And it so happened that I went on a Sunday where he was celebrating the solstice. And it was incredibly just moving for me. He had everybody write down several things that they wanted to let go of for the year. And then he had a ceramic bowl in the center of he owned the yoga studio, so he could do this. He had a ceramic bowl in the center with some fire in it. And each of us went up one by one and threw our pieces of paper into the fire. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, it's the Modern Mystics podcast. This is likely a ritual or tradition that you've probably participated in at some point. And if you haven't, I hope that you do at some point. It's really beautiful. But that changed my perspective in my life, really. It was that Winter Solstice event. And ever since then, it's just held so much meaning for me because what's happening at the Winter Solstice is that we're moving toward darkness, right? We are progressively having shorter and shorter days until December 21st. And the darkness feels scary. It's getting colder. We want out of it. We want it to be light. We want to walk out of swimming and have it be beachy and sunshiny and sandy and wonderful. We want to walk out into our lives and have it like that. But that is just not what's happening, okay? And one of my most favorite mantras, oddly, is not in Sanskrit. It's just in English. And it is, "This is what's happening now." I say this to myself all the time, all day, every day. And I recommend that you do too, because it helps you to keep yourself in check and bring you back to reality. Because there's no point in arguing with reality. And the reality is right now, darkness is happening. So again, this is not just an external situation. This is a psychological situation. And this is something that ancient peoples were really tuned into and were really good at assessing. So when it was getting darker, they weren't trying to resist it. They weren't trying to do things that needed more light. They were sleeping more. They were nurturing themselves more. They were telling stories by the fire. They were holding each other more because it was cold. They were spending time in the darkness. And this is so important. It provides us the space for introspection, reflection, and release. And the really important, the critical, the key, the crux here is that we experience this fully in order to make the return into the light. Now, we have cycles of dark and light all the time. We have it every day. We go from a night to a day every 24 hours. The moon itself goes from darkness at the new moon to light at the full moon, and it moves through this process slowly over the course of 28 days. So cycles of dark and light happen, but this is the most profound, significant, this is the longest dark light cycle that we have, and it happens over the course of a year. So it takes a little more time. It asks us to go a little more deeply into the darkness of our own psyche. Because one thing that we know as mystics is that everything out there has a reflection on the inside. So this is in alignment with the great alchemical principle, as above, so below. So as the sun outside starts to wane and disappear, the light on the inside of us also wanes and disappears. This is not scary. This is not terrible. We know it's still there, right? If we're looking at the astronomical perspective, the light is just more pronounced on the southern hemisphere. So if we look at it on the internal alchemical perspective, the sun is still there. The light is still there. It's just buried beneath the darkness that is now very present and asking to be seen. All of us has darkness. We all do. It's just a part of being human. We often think of it as the unconscious. Okay, so let me give you a quick overview of some basic psychological principles. This is very important because yoga is a psychology, astrology is a psychology, and as spiritual leaders and modern mystics, we are dealing with the psyche. So the psyche can be roughly broken up into 3 parts. And if you've ever taken any psychological classes in your local college or anything like that, Psychology 101, you will have learned this. If you've ever studied Freud, he has kind of a basic iteration of this as well. This is not new stuff. I'm not making this up. This is pretty simple. But the 3 basic parts of the psyche are, number 1, the unconscious. And in Freud's terms, this would be the id. So the unconscious are all of the hidden parts of you, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's very aptly named. These are the things that you don't readily know. These are the things that you can't consciously act upon, call up, or control. We have our conscious mind, which is largely the ego. So our ego, the conscious mind, is actually a very, very small part of our psyche. The biggest part of our psyche is that unconscious. Conscious is, honestly, it's annoyingly small. It doesn't have perspective. It doesn't have the heavy weight it needs to be able to throw around because the unconscious is basically dominating it all the time. The conscious, the ego mind is very reactive instead of proactive. It's always, defensive instead of offensive. It's problematic, and it's one of the biggest reasons why yoga spends so much time in meditation, because meditation is trying to just get that conscious ego mind to just still for a minute, to calm down for a second, so that we can start to glean insights from these other bigger parts of our psyche. And then we have the supra ego, or the supra consciousness, and that's supra, right? So above or beyond our consciousness. And this is the part of us that is most connected to source, that is connected to something bigger than us, that is connected to the collective. So when there is something that we all just seem to know, that's that higher part of us that is interconnected. It's the web. If you've ever seen that wonderful movie Avatar, then you, I forget what it's called actually, and maybe one of my podcast listeners will write in and remind me. There's that beautiful tree that is connecting all of the things, and the characters in Avatar have these like tails that come from their braids that they can connect to other things. That's our supra consciousness. Frankly, I wish I had a tail coming from my braid to connect everything. I think in some ways it would be easier. But we still have that ability. Okay, so these are the 3 main parts of the psyche. Now, the unconscious is the darkness. And this is where our complexes, our triggers, our emotions are buried. So every time we react to something, it's coming from our unconscious. We're not proacting. We're not acting. We're reacting. So when we react to something, we're literally reacting the very first time that event ever occurred. Okay, so let me give you an example. When you were a small child, say, your parents got in a fight. And this is an example, so I don't know if this is true for you or not, but I'm telling the story just in case it is. And even if it's not, you can imagine that this is a scenario that people go through. So as a child, let's say your parents get in a fight, and you witness that, and it scares you. It's scary to witness parents fighting. Who knows what they were fighting about? Who knows if it was even a bad fight? But you see the fight and you run away. And you withdraw from the situation and you hide under the stairs. And as a 5-year-old, boy, that feels great. Like, that's a great resolution to that problem. You're no longer in the realm of the fighting. You're out of the fray. You don't have to witness the bad things that mommy and daddy are saying. And you're hiding under the stairs, and that feels good. And that's a great way to soothe yourself. Okay, so at 5 years old, we can agree that running away from parents fighting is an appropriate reaction. But if you're 35 years old and you're in a fight with somebody and you feel reactive, your MO will be to run away and to try and withdraw from the situation, to exit the fight, to not hear what's happening, to remove yourself, to avoid it altogether. And at 35 years old, that reaction is not super sexy. But again, it is a reaction, because at 5 years old, your psyche, your young developing psyche, decided that the way to deal with conflict is to exit and remove yourself from it. And you never really went back and re-examined that. You never went back to see, like, okay, hey, you know what? That was a great idea at 5, but at 35, not such a great idea. I actually have to stand and face the music. I got to see what's happening here. So this is the value of mining the darkness. Okay, every single reaction that you have is actually coming from something that occurred much, much longer ago. I know that sounds reductive. I know that may also sound cliche, but I hate to tell you, it's the truth. Basically, all forms of psychology are based on this, all right? Your inner child needs a little cuddling. So we've got to go back and do that work. And the work of being an adult, the shadow work, the true work of being an adult, is to actually notice when reactions or triggers happen and to do the work of tracing them back to see where in that darkness that first occurred. What was it that the original intention was, and how does it still serve me? Does it even still serve me? Is it completely outdated? Do we need to just abandon this particular reaction and rewrite it for something else that's actually more appropriate for who we are now? So here's a statement that it blew me away, okay, the first time I heard it, and I wanted to argue with it. The statement is this: we are never angry for the reason that we think we are. Okay, I'll say that again, because for me it was very impactful, and it might be for you too. We are never angry for the reason that we think we are. So anytime anger comes up, and I know, when you're angry and you're angry with someone or at someone or because of someone, it is so easy to say, but no, it's this incident, it's their fault, this is what's happening, they did this, or even they did this to me. I understand, and I don't want to diminish how strange and crazy sometimes people's behaviors are, but you must allow for the possibility that there might also be other ways to respond to this particular situation, which don't include anger. You could be curious about it. You could be indifferent about it. You could be actually kind of prodded into hysterics, thinking, oh my God, this is so silly, right? It doesn't have to be anger. So when anger or fury comes up, or even sadness, it's not actually in reaction to what's happening at that moment. This is your clue that it's actually in reaction to something that happened a long time ago. And this is your darkness. And this is what you're being called to look at and this is what you're being called to hang out with at this time of year, to stay with, to be with, to just rest for a little while in the discomfort that the darkness might be. Because the discomfort is simply the lack of growth and the lack of attention to that young person who initially made that decision. And sometimes all we have to do is take ourselves back, either through hypnosis or meditation or a guided visualization or a nice long shavasana, and be with that young part of ourselves that made that initial decision. See what those initial intentions were, and then what is revealed is actually the light. Remember how in the winter in the northern hemisphere, the light is in the southern hemisphere? So psychologically, right, that's true too. So when we have this darkness pervading our psyche right now, we'll find the light when we go down under. So if we can see what the original intention is behind some of our triggers, reactions, complexes, emotions, we grow ourselves up into a more appropriate, healthy, sustainable place for who we are now as evolving mystics, as evolving yogis. And it just doesn't happen unless we are given the gift of hanging out in the dark. So remember this as we move towards December 21st, our winter solstice. And I do hope that you will celebrate the solstice with me, just as people around the world have been doing for millennia upon millennia. And a good practice is the one that my initial yoga teacher taught. On December 21st, the darkest, longest night of the year, take some time in a ritual to consider what 2019 has been for you. What have you witnessed? What has challenged you? What has stopped you? What has bothered you? What has triggered you? And what has that brought up for you and within you? And if you write down essentially a letter to yourself about the things that you wish you'd learned, the things that you'd like to let go of, the parts of yourself that you are ready to surrender. The return to the light on the solstice is a bit like a resurrection. We're going from this darkness, this rather dead, bleak place of a winter solstice, and moving toward the light. So which parts of you are you ready to let die? Are you ready to let go of? And this can't be done in frustration or anger. Like, I'm so ready to let go of that part that is always attracted to that kind of person. No, you have to go in with compassion and realize why you're attracted to that person in the first place. Maybe it's because you just want the attention of someone special. Well, that's not a bad intention, right? That's actually a really beautiful intention. But maybe that someone special is different than who you thought it was. Okay, so there's lots of ways to look at this. But when you write your letter to yourself on December 21st and you choose what you're ready to let go of, leave open-ended what you want to bring in, okay? Because we're still in the darkness. Allow for things to be as they are. Just sit with the darkness, let go, and allow for whatever may come, whatever is possible to arise for you starting on December 22nd. So historically, people knew that the longest night of the year was around the 21st or the 22nd, and they didn't really notice that the days were getting longer until a few days later, until they saw the return of the sun on or about December 25th. So if you can think about that and do a word play in your head, they saw the return of the sun, S-U-N, or the return of the sun, S-O-N, on December 25th. So a little bit of a religious and historical lesson for you. December 25th is currently celebrated as Christmas and has been for a long time. And it's on that day that many around the world celebrate the birth of Jesus. But that date was picked because of the pagan holiday of Yule around the solstice. And it was much easier to get everybody together to celebrate the same holiday if they could kind of match them up. So they melded the stories a little bit. They took the astronomy and the astrology and the psychology of the time, and then they had this beautiful mythology of the birth of the sun that tied nicely in together for this Christmas holiday on the 25th, which is the day that it becomes very evident the days are actually getting longer after the solstice. So just a little bit of a fun historical bit of fact for you there to consider as you celebrate whatever it is you do celebrate over these next coming weeks. And regardless of what you choose to celebrate mythologically or religiously, I hope that you'll celebrate mystically and spiritually with me the winter solstice on December 21st. So everyone, thank you so much for listening to the Modern Mystics podcast. As always, it's been a treat and a pleasure to be here with you. And if you want to continue to join this conversation and talk more about the solstice, I go live every single week in the highereducation.yoga membership. And again, for my podcast listeners, I invite you to do a $1 trial of that membership by visiting highereducation.yoga/trial. And I'll be back next week for more. We're doing a lot of astrology talk. Next week, we'll be talking about the planets and astrology and as they pertain to the modern mystic. So if that is right up your alley, then look forward to next week's podcast. And of course, after that, we'll be talking about New Year's intentions and how a mystic might set yourself up for success. All right, you guys, lots of fun stuff to come, and check out the podcasts in the past. And if you have enjoyed them, then please do leave a nice review on iTunes. It really helps, and it helps others find the podcast too. And of course, we are here to support each other and help each other step into our roles as spiritual leaders and modern mystics. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you next week.